Hi everyone, welcome to my video which I've made to explain and demonstrate how to use the Bootstrap grid to make your websites responsive to different screen sizes. The Bootstrap grid and all Bootstrap classes are part of a library that is a library of pre-written CSS that you can access and use on your own projects. So we access these different CSS settings using the Bootstrap class names on our HTML elements. So you have to make sure that the class names that you're using are the correct ones for the library of CSS that Bootstrap has provided. In order to get started, we make sure that our HTML pages are linked up to the Bootstrap library, and you do that by grabbing this link here that's provided in the Get Started documentation in the Bootstrap website. Make sure that you're using Bootstrap version 4. It doesn't matter if it's higher than 4.3.1. As long as it's Bootstrap 4, then this video should give you the correct class names to use when you're building your grid. So first I'm just going to show you, this is a project that I made. It's my first milestone for the Code Institute course. I want to show you how using the grid can change the look of your site on different pages. So if you see here, I've got a how to order page with 5 steps to it. And on a desktop, having these next to each other works. But you can imagine that if I squeezed the screen size down and they were still taking up this much width of their container, that this would become unreadable. Things would start overlapping, or the text would start stacking on top of itself so far down here that it would be impossible to read it. So what Bootstrap does is it provides a way to rearrange the content on your page simply by adding extra class names to your HTML elements. So if I use developer tools here to switch to viewing this on a tablet, you can see that now the content has been spaced out differently, and we've got them taking up less, they're stacking on top of each other and taking up more width of their container because the container has become smaller. This is on an iPad, and if I switch to a Pixel 2, which is a phone, you can see that again the amount of space that these are taking up width-wise has increased because we're on a smaller screen, so we need them to take up less space. So this is the power of what the Bootstrap grid can do with your project. If I switch back to desktop, you can see these are built-in media queries that can do some pretty cool stuff with the way that your site is laid out on different screen sizes. So let me take you to a website that I built to help demonstrate how to use the Bootstrap grid. As I said before, we implement the Bootstrap styles using the Bootstrap library of pre-written CSS. And we need to make sure especially when we're using the grid, that we use our classes in the right order on elements that are nested inside one another in our HTML. So for using the Bootstrap grid, you always need 3 types of grid classes. You need a container, you need at least 1 row, and you need at least 1 column. Each of these elements rely on the others to work correctly. If you mess with the order or you miss one out, then you will start getting problems with the layout of your site. So always remember, container first, then a row, and inside that a column. So your content goes in the columns, and you should not have a column without a row, and you shouldn't have a row without a container. So hopefully this will help explain. In your HTML, you open a container, and inside that you open a row, and inside that you put your columns. So as we can see here, we have 1 container, and that container has 2 rows in it, and each of those rows has a column in it. So when we're structuring our code in HTML, we need to remember to make sure that we're nesting things correctly. And this is the very basic structure that you need. A container, so all of this is a container because the container opens here and it closes here. And then inside that container, we've got a row which opens here and closes here. As long as you indent your HTML correctly so that the opening tag and the closing tag are always directly above and below each other, it's much easier to spot when you accidentally get an extra closing div somewhere, or you haven't closed a HTML element and that's what's messing with your page. So container with a row inside it, and inside that a column. So containers and rows on their own only have width properties by default. They have no height of their own unless you customize that with your own CSS. And their height is usually, by default, is determined by the height of the content inside the columns, which are inside them. In Bootstrap, there are two container classes that you can use. Use one or the other. Don't use both. That will mess with things per container, that is. You can have a container on your page, you can have a container fluid on your page, but don't put both class names on the same HTML element. So we pick one of the two. The difference between these two classes is the width of the screen that they take up. Container fluid will always go out to the full width of the element that it is inside, or if it's only inside the body element, it will go right out to the edge of the screen. A container is slightly more responsive, and if I click on inspect element here and change the width of my screen, you can see that the container adds some padding in the largest size screens, but as you go down it tends to stay the same until it reaches a breakpoint, and then it drops down to a smaller size. Containers tend to fit the content nicely on different screen sizes, but sometimes you want your content to go out to the full width of its container, in which case of the element that it is inside, in which case a container fluid is probably better suited to your needs. But these are the two types of containers that you can use on your HTML. So inside a container, as I've said before, the next thing you need is a row. A row determines a vertical block that your columns will live inside. A row will always go the full width of its container, and so you can have multiple columns within a row. So here we have a container which closes here, and inside that we've got a row, and inside the row we have 1, 2, 3 columns, and you can see how that will look on your screen. So this blue represents the container and the row, which are the full width of their screen. And inside that we've got 3 columns, and the columns are taking up 1/3 of the width of the container each, and they run next to each other. You can also have multiple rows within a container. So in this piece of code here we have one container which starts here and ends down here, and then we have 3 rows, each with a column inside. So here's one row with a column inside it, and we repeat that again. So we closed the first row here and we opened a new one here. This one closes here and we open a new one here. So we can see that's how it comes out. So rows will always stack on top of each other. They won't take up, they won't share their horizontal space with anything, unless you change something in the CSS, but that's kind of defeating the point of a row. So leave it the way it is. And if you really want to start playing with the functionality of the Bootstrap grid, you can even put a row inside a column and then more columns inside that row. So here we have an example of one container with a row, and inside that row we have 2 columns. There's one that begins and ends here, and then a second column here, which is already nested in a row, as you can see. But inside this column we have another row, and inside that row we have 2 columns. So that's how this is how it looks. The container is the dark blue line that goes around the whole lot, and then we have one row here which has 2 columns in, and the second column has another row with 2 more columns inside. So you can see how flexible, how much flexibility that gives you when you decide how you want your site to look. So as we move on to columns, this is where it starts getting a bit more interesting. Bootstrap columns come in 12 sizes. A column width is set by giving it a number between 1 and 12. So a col 1 takes up 1/12 of the width of its container. A col 6 is 6/12, and therefore 2 6s make 12, so 6/12 is a half, so it's 50% width of its container. A col 12 will take up 12/12, therefore the whole of the width of its container. So as you can see, having 12 different size choices gives you a huge number of choices about the way that you arrange your columns and the widths that you give it. So here we started a col 1 and make our way all the way down to a col 12. Columns will always display next to each other until their total adds up to 12. So as we can see here, excuse me, we have a col 9 and a col 3. 9 and 3 add up to 12, so between them they take up the full width of their container. The same here for a col 2, a col 8 and another col 2, also adds up to 12. So as you can see, we've got a lot of choices in the way that we arrange our content using the column classes. Excuse me. So each of these is their own row. We have a row with a 9 and 3 adding up to 12, and each of them separated by this white gap is a different row. If we had a col 9 and a col 3 in a row with another col 9 and another col 3, the second pair would just display directly underneath it. We'll get to that. I'll show you a bit more of that in a moment. So now that we understand the different size of columns that we can have, you might be thinking ahead and thinking, well, yes, we saw how these columns looked on a big screen, but once we start reducing the size of the screen down, the content's going to get pretty squashed, isn't it? So we want to be able to say to the browser, well, in a big screen, maybe I do want 3 col 4s next to each other, but on a mobile, I would want those to stack on top of each other maybe. So how would we tell the browser, I want it to be a col 12 full width on a small screen, but on a big screen, I want them to be col 4s displaying next to each other. So Bootstrap have solved this one for you too. The real magic of the Bootstrap grid is that it is responsive to screen sizes. So 2 columns next to each other might look great on a desktop, but the same layout on a narrow mobile screen would really start squashing things, making images really tiny, text stacking on top of each other too much. That would be really hard to read and would be a very bad user experience. So Bootstrap has these built-in media queries that you can add to your column class names. SM is for small devices, which is phones from 576 pixels up. The smallest phones, for instance, I have a Galaxy S5, I think, the screen size goes underneath 576 pixels. So in that case, it would be the default setting of column size, which I'll get to in a moment. MD is for medium devices like tablets and up. LG is for large devices like desktop size screens and up. And XL is for the largest of our screens of 1200 pixels and up. So to add responsive column classes in our class names that we're putting on our HTML elements, there are these different. So let's say sorry, I get myself lost here. So if we take a look at this code that I've written here, we can apply multiple column classes to the same HTML element. So here we have a col 12 and a col MD6. Both of these classes are sitting on the same HTML element. And this means that by default, this column will take up 12/12, therefore 100% of the width of its container. But this one says, when you get to a medium-sized screen or larger, we switch from being a col 12 to being a col 6. And therefore, 6 and 6 make up 12. And so these two columns would go from being stacked on top of each other on smaller screens to being next to each other on larger screens. It's really important to note that Bootstrap media queries work on the mobile first model. So every class name that you use with a media query SM, MD, LG, XL in applies to all the screen sizes that size and larger, unless of course you apply another class larger still. However, let's get back to the basics here. So here we have two columns, and they both have the classes of col12 and colMD6 on them. This is from this code. And if I reduce the screen size down below the medium size screen, we can see that that colMD6 no longer applies and the col12 has taken over, because we're now on a small size screen, not a medium size screen. We've gone underneath the breakpoint for medium size screens. So when I flip back, when I increase the size of the screen again, my browser feels like playing along with me, we can see that we've gone into the medium size screen. And as I widen out, we're now in the large size screen, and here we're in the extra large size screen. But the colMD6 will apply to all screen sizes, medium size or larger, unless you add another colLG, for instance, on top of it to give it another size for a larger screen. So here are some other responsive columns in action for you to see. I'm going to take it right down to the smallest size screen here. So in this first row here, we have a col6 and a colSM8 and a col6 and a colSM4. So 8 and 4 are both being applied to the small size screen. Right now we're in the default size screen. We've gone underneath the 576, I think it is, pixels width of the screen. So we're on the smallest mobile size screen right now. And so the col6 is the one that's being applied to these columns here, as well as these ones underneath. We'll get to those in a minute. So right now, looking at this row, when we go up to the small size screen, this column becomes 8/12 of the width of its container, which is 2/3. And this one, because when we get to a small size screen, will become 4/12 or 1/3 of the width of its screen. So if I increase the screen size up, we can see that we've gone from two col6s to a colSM8 and a colSM4. So that gives you some idea of the power of how to change the size of your content and how it's arranging on different screen sizes. So if we come down here to this row, and these two here, these two columns are in the same row in their HTML, but because they are set to col12s, they're stacking on top of each other because we've reached the maximum of 12 here, so the next one automatically comes underneath. But as you can see, they also have column classes for a medium-sized screen on them. This one has a colMD5 and this one has a colMD7. 5 and 7 add up to 12. So we know that once we get up to a medium-sized screen, they're going to be on the same line next to each other, no longer stacking on top of each other. And we know that this one is going to be 5/12 and this one is going to be 7/12 of the screen. So if I go up to the next size, we can see that that's exactly what's happened. And you probably note down here in this row, these ones are col12s. And because we've not set any class sizes for a small screen or a medium-sized screen, they have stayed 12/12 of the width of their container, or 100% of the width of their container each. And all three of these are in the same row again, but because they have added up to 12 on each line, they've stacked on top of each other. So if I increase the size of the screen, and we keep going until we reach the large size, they have all become 4/12 of the width of their screen, and therefore 1/3 of the screen each, or 1/3 of their container each. And these last ones here are all again in the same row, but because they've been set to col6, they're always going to be 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And these ones haven't had any classes set for a screen size, medium, small or large, like these ones have here, so they've remained at a col6. But as we increase the size of the screen, hopefully you can imagine what's going to happen when we reach the extra large size screen. we have 4 3s. 4 3s add up to 12. So as we go up, now they've all jumped to taking up a quarter of the width of their container each. And you might have guessed that we can also apply more than 2 column classes to the same HTML element. Excuse me. We can apply 3, 4, even 5 if we wanted to the same HTML element for each size of the screen, the default, small, medium, large, and extra large. That's not normally necessary to go that far, but it's good to know that you can do it. So these 3 elements here have all got the same class names on them: col12, colMD4, and colLG5. So if I reduce this down, hopefully you can imagine what's going to happen. They all become 100% width of their container, and they stack on top of each other because they're 12s. And then as we increase the screen, and right now we're in a small size screen, but it hasn't changed because the col12 is still being applied. Then we go up to a medium size screen, and they have become colMD4s, and they're taking up a third of the width of their container each. And as you probably saw, once we get to a large size screen, they become colLG5s. Now 3 5s adds up to 15, doesn't it? So that's not going to fit. So the CSS automatically puts that third one down into the next row, and it leaves a white gap here and another one here, which doesn't look all that pretty. So what could we do? Well, you probably guessed, Bootstrap have thought of that too. So let's take a look at the last section on my demo page here. When the column's total width adds up to more than 12, one of those or more of those columns are going to drop underneath. And having them stuck up against the left side of the screen is not exactly great user experience most of the time. So what can we do to fix it? We can use the Justify Content classes that Bootstrap provides. We apply these classes to the row that the columns are inside, not the columns themselves. This goes on the row, and it tells the columns how to behave when there's spacing involved. Their total number doesn't add up to 12. So how should the row arrange those columns within itself? So if we take a look at this HTML here, take a look at these class names that I've applied here. Each of these rows has inside it 3 col2s. I've not included that because that made the HTML code snippet very long. But if you can imagine, these 3 dots represent 3 col2s in each of these rows. So these rows have different Justify Content classes attached to them. And below you can see how they affect the positions of the columns within the rows. So this is Justify Content Start, where all the columns are on the left-hand side. And by default, that is where they would be. Most of the time, you wouldn't need to apply Justify Content Start on its own to a row, unless it's inheriting some CSS from somewhere else and you need to put it back to its default setting. Justify Content End does what it says on the tin. It pushes all 3 of these columns off to the right-hand side. We don't have any more columns here that are adding up to 12. So this is just saying to the row, okay, we're going to push all the columns to the end of the row, all the way off to the right. Justify Content Center, again, does what it says on the tin. It puts all of the content in the center, and there are no gaps in between them. Justify Content Between takes the spacing, and it puts it between the columns, as you can see here, and it pushes the columns on each end right out to the end of the row, and puts this one in the middle. If we had 3 col2s, for instance, then we would still have 1 column right up at the end of each side. The spacing between the other 2 columns would be evenly spread out. And Justify Content Around, again, takes the spacing, but it puts it around each of the columns, as we can see here. And true to form, Bootstrap have also given us media queries that we can apply to our Justify Content classes as well. So, for example, maybe we would like our content of our columns to be up against the left-hand side on a desktop, but on a mobile screen, we want them in the middle. We can play around with these things to get them to do exactly what we want. So we can use the same SM, MD, LG, XL classes on our Justify content classes. You have to make sure that you put them in the right place. You can't put Justify SM Content Center. Bootstrap won't know what to do with that. It has to be Justify Content, the media query class that we want, and then where we want them to be. So, for example, I've created for you here a row with 3 col2s inside, just like before. So there are no columns filling up this space here. The Justify Content classes are telling the row where to put the columns. But we've also added media queries in. So this row has a Justify Content SM center. So on small screens or larger, it's going to be in the center. Until we get to the MD one, which we've also set. So we have Justify Content MD around. So on a medium-sized screen and larger, the spacing is going to be around the col2s. But we also have one for Justify Content XL end. So on the largest screen size, the column 2s are going to be up to the end. And you can see that's where they're positioned right now in my example row here. So this row has those classes applied to it. And hopefully you can imagine, right now we're in extra large size screen. So what happens when we drop down to a large size screen? Well, XL is applying to extra large screens and larger, not below that. So below that would be the MD one, because MD applies to medium-sized screen and larger, unless there's something written to go over it. So if we reduce the screen size down to a large size screen, our columns have changed position, and now the spacing is laid out around them. And then if we reduce the screen size down, now we're in medium-sized screen, here we're in large size screen. We get down to the small size screen, and you can see now our column 2s have now come into the center, and all the spacing is on either side of them. And what do you think might happen once I go underneath the small size screen into the default one? Can you remember? Well, let's see. The default setting was Justify Content Start, which is on the left-hand side. So I hope that's helped you to understand how you can use the power of the Bootstrap Grid to arrange your content on your website in lots and lots of different ways. I'm going to add a link to this demo site that I made underneath the video here, so you can take a look at it, you can play around with it on your own. I might have edited some things by the time you come to it, but hopefully it'll just be making it better rather than worse. There are some links on the final page for further reading. You can take a look at the Bootstrap 4 documentation, which has not just the grid classes in, but all the other things for navigation bars and buttons and forms, and there's so much in there. And it is a bit overwhelming to start with, but if you spend some time starting to play around with these things, you'll start to realize how much time this saves you. You don't have to write every line of CSS yourself. It's already there. There's a link to the Bootstrap 4 documentation on the grid system and also on the spacing. And finally, there's a link to another YouTube video, not by me, that also helps to explain and demonstrate the Bootstrap Grid if you need a bit more understanding. Thank you for sticking around for my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave me a comment or stop by, find me on Slack if you're another Code Institute student, and I'm happy to answer any questions you've got.